Some crimes leave behind more than victims. They leave secrets, unanswered questions, and mysteries that refuse to disappear. Welcome to Dark Case Diaries. Join us as we uncover true crime stories, shocking investigations, and the hidden truths behind some of the world's most fascinating cases. Let's begin.
Today, we're unpacking a really unsettling case. It's essentially a masterclass in perception versus reality and how physical evidence can completely unravel a meticulously staged scene. We're looking at the incredibly chilling story of Jimmy and Amy Allen. Now, on the surface, they seem like your perfectly normal couple living out their lives in Michigan. But as investigators were about to discover, the reality of what actually happened in their basement on the night of September 14, 2018 was far, far darker than anyone could have guessed. So, let's walk through the evidence step by step and uncover the anatomy of a lie.
We're going to start right in the middle of the chaos. Picture this scene. 37-year-old Jimmy Allen calls 911, and his voice is just dripping with absolute desperation. He tells the dispatcher he's just found his wife, Amy, unresponsive in their basement, and he says he's actively performing CPR. But when Officer Ben J. Horn is the very first to arrive at the house, it's eerily silent. There's no commotion, no yelling, nothing. It's actually only when the officer makes his presence known that Jimmy suddenly starts crying out for help, and he's found sobbing over Amy's body. EMTs rush in, they take over the life-saving efforts, and then, seemingly out of nowhere, an EMT emerges with this incredible glimmer of hope. He says she's fighting. Amy actually still had a faint pulse.
And that right there brings us to a massive moment of cognitive dissonance for the first responders. When Jimmy realized his wife was actually still clinging to life, his reaction was, well, it was incredibly jarring. He didn't seem relieved. In fact, he seemed visibly frustrated by the news. I mean, ask yourself, why on earth would a supposedly grieving, desperate husband be annoyed that his wife is still breathing? For the officers on the scene, this immediate, totally bizarre reaction set off massive alarm bells. It was the very first crack in Jimmy's facade, a behavioral red flag that just completely defied the narrative of a tragic accident or a desperate rescue attempt.
And you know, that frustration definitely wasn't the only weird thing happening that night. Police immediately started spotting a whole series of glaring red flags. Like we just talked about, the house was dead silent until Jimmy literally realized the police were standing right there. Then, when he was on the phone with his parents, supposedly crying his heart out, officers noticed there was absolutely zero moisture or tears on his face. None. Jimmy kept alternating between this weird calculated composure and these dramatic, highly theatrical outbursts, like literally ripping his shirt off. In one of the most bizarre moments, he walked calmly upstairs to the kitchen and just suddenly unleashed all this wrath onto a bowl of potato chips, just destroyed it. And perhaps the most damning thing of all regarding his behavior, he waited a full 14 hours to even bother calling Amy's family to tell them what happened. Now, despite all this frankly bizarre behavior, Jimmy handed the police what he thought was an absolutely perfect alibi. He framed the whole evening as just a totally normal family night that somehow, inexplicably, ended in tragedy.
Let's move to his timeline and see how this builds, because Jimmy laid out an incredibly exact sequence of events. He says at 6:30 p.m., the family has dinner and they drop their daughter and her friend off at a high school football game. After that, Jimmy and Amy go bar hopping. At JR's pub, Jimmy claims they get into an argument because he brings up moving back down south and Amy is just being dismissive about it. We actually have security footage confirming that at 7:58 p.m., Amy left and walked home alone. Jimmy says he drove home shortly after, and at 8:05 p.m., they got into another argument down in the basement because she accused him of slamming a door in her face. So Jimmy claims he just left her there, went upstairs, and put on the Jim Carrey movie Ace Ventura. Then, exactly 35 minutes later at 8:40 p.m., he goes down to check on her before picking up their daughter, and he claims he discovers her hanging from an extension cord.
It's a very detailed story. But here's the thing about stories. They have to align with the physical reality of the scene. And the forensics told a completely different tale.
And this brilliantly illustrates the immediate, glaring logistical problem the investigators faced. The physical reality of that basement simply didn't add up. Think about it. Amy was 5 foot 6 inches tall. The basement ceiling was unusually low, measuring roughly 7 feet high. Now, Jimmy claimed he found her suspended from an extension cord, using an upturned kitty litter pail as a step. The detectives looked at that ceiling, looked at Amy's height, and instantly realized the geometry was practically impossible. There just literally wasn't enough vertical clearance for the event Jimmy was describing to have actually happened in that specific room.
But Detective Larry Rothman didn't just guess here. He let the science do the talking. First, he took that exact extension cord and sent it to a forensic engineering lab in Michigan. They recreated the whole scenario. And their conclusion? The cord absolutely could not suspend 140 pounds. Under those exact circumstances, Amy's feet would have easily touched the ground. Second, Officer Horn and later the hospital staff noted there were zero typical hanging injuries or external trauma. There was just this very faint mark near her jugular. Finally, the medical examiner confirmed the terrible truth. Tragically, Amy passed away 3 days later, and her autopsy determined the actual cause of death was strangulation asphyxiation. This was a homicide, meticulously staged by someone to look like a suicide.
So, the physical evidence proves beyond a doubt that Jimmy was lying. But why? What was the motive here? To find out, investigators had to step away from the physical crime scene and start digging into the couple's digital footprints.
What they found was a massive disconnect between Jimmy's version of reality and everyone else's. During police interviews, Jimmy described his life as the absolute pinnacle. He called himself a type A personality, super focused on mental health, rock climbing, and, growing vegetables. He even tried to blame Amy's isolation on her playing too much World of Warcraft. But Amy's family, they told a completely different story. They revealed that Jimmy was actually deeply, deeply controlling. He monitored everything the family did. He constantly tracked Amy's phone, always demanding to know her exact location. And honestly, worst of all, he forced Amy to isolate from her own 17-year-old son, Caleb, from a previous relationship. He had effectively banned her from speaking to her own family.
But as it turns out, Amy was actively seeking an escape from that toxic environment. When detectives looked into Amy's phone, they dropped a massive bombshell. She had been carrying on a 3-year secret affair with a married man from the East Coast named George. They had actually met up in person twice and were talking constantly. And here is the kicker. On the very day of the incident, while Jimmy thought Amy was just being negative about his plans to move south, she was actually texting George. At 5:29 p.m., she texted, "I'm excited to see you again." During that whole argument at JR's pub, while sitting right next to Jimmy, she was texting George those exact words. Suddenly, a new terrifying theory emerged. What if Jimmy caught a glimpse of those messages, realized his absolute control over her was slipping, and flew into a fatal rage?
Armed with this new motive, Detective Rothman brings Jimmy in for a formal interview. When asked about any infidelity, Jimmy was super arrogant. He claimed Amy didn't even have the capacity to cheat because she was supposedly too introverted. So the detective literally slides the printed, explicit text messages between Amy and George right across the table. And Jimmy's reaction? Just absolute, total denial. He stares right at the proof and says, "I still just don't all the way believe you guys." He ended up taking a polygraph test, which came back inconclusive, and then, showcasing just a really staggering ability to compartmentalize his life, Jimmy packed up, fled to Florida, moved in with his parents, and amazingly, found a new fiancée. Seriously, his new wedding was scheduled for just 5 days away when police finally showed up in Florida to arrest him for murder.
So the crucial point is how this all plays out in court. Fast forward to September of 2021, 3 years after Amy's tragic death, and the murder trial officially begins.
Let's look impartially at how this courtroom showdown actually played out. On the prosecution side, they came out swinging with the science. Dr. Elizabeth Buck testified that the extension cord test failed definitively. They also brought in Amy's son, Caleb, who delivered some really harrowing testimony that Jimmy had a documented history of violence, even recalling a time Jimmy choked him from behind until he gasped for air. They highlighted that complete lack of typical hanging injuries, and they actually brought George to the stand to confirm the affair was very real. Now, on the flip side, the defense argued that Amy's blood alcohol content was 0.09%, which they claimed showed a history of heavy drinking that caused her to act out. Their expert, Dr. Francisco J. Diaz, argued that because there were no defensive scratch marks on Jimmy, no struggle could have occurred. They tried to paint the affair with George as just a fantasy to cope with her isolation, and ultimately called the prosecution's entire timeline utter speculation.
But in the end, the jury had to weigh the raw physics of the scene against the defense's theories. And after about 6 hours of deliberation, they came back with their verdict. They absolutely did not buy Jimmy's timeline or his story of a perfect, healthy marriage. The jury found Jimmy Allen guilty of the lesser offense of second-degree murder. On October 21, 2021, Jimmy was sentenced to 20 to 45 years in a Michigan correctional facility. And to put that in perspective, he won't even be eligible for parole until the year 2040.
Which really leaves us with this final, chilling thought to take away. Jimmy Allen presented himself to the world as the absolute pinnacle of health, this type A provider who is just trying to save his family. But the digital records, the forensic engineering, and the undeniable physical reality of that low basement ceiling told the true story. A story of deep isolation, total control, and ultimate tragedy. It really makes you wonder, how well do we ever truly know what happens behind closed doors?
And that's the story behind this shocking case. What do you think really happened? Was justice served, or are there still unanswered questions waiting to be solved? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this investigation, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new case from Dark Case Diaries. Until next time, stay curious, stay alert, and remember, every case has a secret. Thanks for watching.